Hello everyone, my name is Engelbutzeder and in this video I will present the Tokai 2023 paper From Surplus and Scarcity Towards Abundance, Understanding the Use of ICT in Food Resource Sharing Practices, that I have written together with the co-authors Dave Randall, Marvin Landwehr, Konstantin, Gunnar and Volker Wulf. In short, the presentation showcases the impact of ICT on enhancing sustainable food practices within a grassroots movement, suggesting that complementing food sharing with food resource sharing could facilitate a shift from scarcity and surplus to abundance, thereby promoting local actions with global implications. In the hands-on project, Vegetables Seek a Home, people from all generations are invited to adopt a young vegetable plant. The community of adoptive parents then try out and learn together how to care for the plants until they are harvested and how to use them afterwards. In order to learn together, the participants come together in a digital group on the instant messenger Telegram, where messages and pictures of their experiences can be shared. Some experts in vegetable growing are also present to answer questions about plant health and distribute illustrative information material. Away from the virtual space, the learning experience is complemented by face-to-face encounters. The project creates opportunities for participants to get to know each other, try things out, and exchange ideas. One occasion for joint meetings is, for example, gardening together. Cooking evenings are also organized where food is prepared and eaten during a pleasant get-together. The local community is part of the broader food sharing movement, which aids more than 369 local districts and cities by using their joint platform, foodsharing.de, to save and share surplus food. Since its inception in 2012, Foodsharing.de has facilitated over 8.5 million food pickups and has attracted more than 172,000 volunteers. Food sharing is all about giving away food and food products, often to deal with the problem of too much food in one place and not enough in another. This can happen in a few ways. People might share food in exchange for money, to help out those in need, or to build community spirit. The main reason behind food sharing is to address the lack of enough food for everyone in certain areas, making sure that those who need food can get it. It is focused on making sure food gets used rather than wasted. On the other hand, food resource sharing goes a step further. It's not just about passing around food that's ready to eat. It's about sharing the very things needed to grow food, like seeds, soil, and know-how. This includes teaching others how to grow food, sharing recipes, and even creating communal garden spaces. The goal here is more about community building and helping everyone become more self-reliant when it comes to food. It introduces a sense of abundance with an emphasis on both using and producing food. This approach encourages a sustainable way of living, where communities support each other by growing and sharing food, leading to a stronger, more resilient food system. Our perspective aligns with Weber et al., who advocate for deep change in food systems in terms of values, consumption and production practices, and policies that enable grassroots consultation and mobilization. Taking into account local needs, grassroots movements shape the immediate context of daily life, opening spaces for participation and contribution. Those movements are a source of innovation and have the power to mobilize the resources needed for change towards sustainability. Regarding food sharing practices, there's focus on the redistribution of surplus food within sustainable HCI. Yet there's also an increased interest in the synergy between consumption and production, highlighting the rise of prosumers. Related work on ICT and scaling emphasizes the importance of designing ICT that supports community-level sustainability efforts, leveraging grassroots movements and existing resources to foster collaboration, enhancing food sharing and addressing broader sustainability challenges. Next, we look into the methods of our research. Author 1 sees himself as a food activist who is committed to the transformation of food practices towards sustainability, both locally and globally. Our qualitative data includes informal conversations, field notes, and 21 semi-structured interviews. After the initial data collection, thematic analysis began and new research data were collected iteratively. According to the action research approach, we followed cycles of inquiry that included planning, action, and reflection, in which the action being undertaken is continually designed and evaluated with the research results emerging throughout these cycles. Next, we come to the results of our research. The Chili project incorporated ICT through the use of Telegram, a messaging app, to create and expand a network of food resource sharing among participants. Approximately 70 individuals adopted Chili plans and became a part of this initiative, with 48 of them joining a dedicated Telegram group. This group served as a hub for active discussions and resource sharing among the members. An important observation from the project was the participants' tendency to prefer familiar technologies, displaying a certain reluctance to adopt new platforms or applications. The use of Telegram, a platform already familiar to many, lowered the barriers to entry, allowing participants to easily integrate into the community and engage with the broader Food Roots community. Furthermore, while the digital platform played a pivotal role in the project, the value of personal interactions and face-to-face support was equally recognized. These elements were particularly essential for some participants, aiding them in navigating new technology and ensuring their active and complete involvement within the community. The initiative leveraged the networking effect by utilizing a Telegram group to catalyze wider participation in local sustainability and urban gardening efforts. The localized actions inspired by the project had ripple effects, contributing to conversations on global sustainability and underscoring the significance of small-scale, community-driven efforts towards achieving larger environmental goals. Central to the community's ethos was the concept of abundance rather than surplus. This philosophy fostered a mindset shift from simply redistributing excess resources to nurturing a culture of shared growth and sustainable practices. ICT, with Telegram in particular, proved crucial in this context. It facilitated the coordination of food resource distribution, the exchange of advice, and the provision of support, thereby bolstering the community's self-reliance and capacity for mutual aid. The discussion encompasses three main points. At first, we investigate the design space from surplus towards abundance. Critiques of merging food waste and food poverty into a win-win solution emphasize the need for a deep change in food systems, advocating for a shift from surplus redistribution to fostering an abundance mentality that supports sustainable food practices through generalized reciprocity and community building. Food resource sharing initiatives like the Chili project demonstrate the potential of ICT-supported community engagement to create networks that share knowledge, resources, and foster local sustainability efforts, moving beyond distributional problems to encourage mutual aid and communal resilience. The design and use of digital tools for food sharing should focus on socio-cultural activities and grassroots foods initiatives, enabling local communities to share expertise and resources abundantly, rather than concentrating solely on food waste redistribution. Local food practices, supported by simple ICT solutions like Telegram, can extend beyond individual projects to wider community contributions, emphasizing the social value of local connections and the sharing of resources, skills, and expertise to achieve sustainability and abundance. The figure highlights that instead of simply redistributing food to address scarcity or combat food poverty, surplus can serve as a catalyst for fostering community building based on the concept of abundance. When grassroots communities share their resources, productive practices, particularly prosumption practices, can thrive. At second, we discuss complex food prosumers. Shifting focus from consumption to prosumption in SHCI can foster community abundance through innovative food resource sharing practices. Food's dual role as a necessity and a medium for solidarity highlights the importance of prosumption practices in SHCI. Sustainable food systems require holistic ICT approaches that support the sharing of food resources, skills, and expertises, emphasizing the interconnected practices of growing, harvesting, processing, and recycling as central to fostering economic, ecological, and social sustainability. The project demonstrated that initial, narrowly defined goals can organically expand into a broader set of shared practices. And at last, we discuss aiming for local impact. Local grassroots efforts contribute to global sustainability by addressing local needs and opening spaces for community contribution, demonstrating the scalability of localized actions into global lessons for sustainable design. The concept of glocal impact, thinking globally while acting locally, underscores the importance of intertwining local initiatives with global networks to seed new communities and change the food system. While ICT plays a crucial role in facilitating community engagement and supporting the scaling of sustainability efforts, overly complex technologies deter participation, highlighting the need for simple, familiar digital environments to foster voluntary community contributions. Design opportunities lie in supporting grassroots movements to scale while nurturing a sharing culture, focusing on simple technical solutions that facilitate local expertise sharing and community growth towards sustainability without promoting competition or individualism. The key takeaways from this paper are: food resource sharing and abundance highlight a novel design space that represents an intersection of HFI and SHCI. Food resource sharing can transcend the limitations of food sharing seen as a distributional problem. It encompasses new forms of distribution. A focus on abundant resources promotes the non-rivalrous approach of the more I share with you, the more will ultimately be shared with others. We should promote a more genuine, cooperative view of consumption and production practices, one that is associated with the concept of the prosumer. Care and support for others is a key element. For ICT, the challenges are to make these contributions count on a local level. Scale is where design opportunities abound. Local activity contributes progressively to a global effort and thereby ultimately creates scalable lessons for design. Thank you for your attention, and please do not hesitate to contact me if you have questions or want to engage into further discussions or actions. Bye.